What a man feels. When a woman goes silent, it haunts him. Carl Jung, have you ever wondered why a woman's silence can wound a man more deeply than her anger? Why the absence of her voice, her laughter, her tender affirmations can leave him restless, haunted, unraveling in the shadows of his own mind? Carl Jung understood this well. The psyche is not undone by noise, but by silence. And when a woman chooses to withdraw her energy, the man who depended upon her reflection begins to face the most terrifying adversary of all, himself. He once believed her presence was constant, a mirror that would forever reflect his power, his charm, his imagined importance. Her gaze fed him, her listening ear confirmed him, her very nearness gave him the illusion that he was whole. But when she withdraws, when she becomes still, he finds the mirror shattered. His ego no longer recognizes its reflection, and so it collapses into fragments. A man can endure conflict. He can endure words sharpened like knives, but what he cannot endure is the abyss of absence. In her silence, he no longer knows who he is. Jung wrote of the anima, the feminine soul image within the male unconscious, the bridge between his outer ego and his inner depths. When a woman goes silent, she awakens this anima, not by feeding it, but by starving it. The man projects onto her the mother who once comforted, the lover who once soothed, the fantasy that once rescued him from emptiness. And when her voice is gone, these projections collapse. He must face the shadow, the part of himself he denied, the wounds he concealed beneath charm, conquest, or dominance. Her silence becomes the doorway to his deepest fear, the fear of being unworthy without her. You may have noticed this in your own life. The man who once seemed strong suddenly falters when ignored. The confident one becomes restless, sending message after message, circling like an addict deprived of his drug. His pride burns, not because of cruelty, but because he no longer holds the leash of her attention. The silence cuts through the illusions of control. It reveals his dependence, his obsession, his hunger for validation. He may tell himself she is cold, manipulative, distant, but beneath those words lies a truth he dares not name. He needs her more than she needs him. This is why silence is feared. Words can be argued with, tears can be soothed, even rage can be confronted. But silence? Silence cannot be negotiated. It is not a weapon swung outward, but a boundary drawn inward. It says without speaking, I no longer exist for the sake of your ego. For a man, this absence reverberates like an unfinished symphony. He hears echoes of what once was, her laughter in memory, her gaze replayed like a ghost, but he cannot summon it back. The more he chases, the more elusive she becomes, not because she hides, but because she has chosen sovereignty. In this space, he begins to confront the reality that his desire was never only love. It was possession. It was projection. It was the need to anchor himself in her reflection. Jung warned that what we do not integrate will rule us as fate. The man who cannot face his shadow will project it onto her, accusing her of cruelty when in truth he is terrified of his own emptiness. Her silence reveals him to himself, and this revelation is unbearable. For centuries, women were told their power lay in sacrifice, in endless giving, in nurturing the wounds of men. Yet the unspoken power has always been in silence. Stillness is not passivity. It is presence turned inward. When a woman detaches, she steps into the archetype of the high priestess, seated between the worlds of seen and unseen. She becomes mystery itself, not because she plays a game, but because she finally refuses to perform. To a man unprepared, this mystery is intoxicating, maddening, even terrifying. He will mistake it for cruelty, but it is not. It is revelation. Imagine him lying awake at night, scrolling through memories, replaying her last glance, her last words, her last touch. He wonders why her absence feels louder than her presence ever did. He wonders why silence stings more than rejection. The truth is this: it is not her voice he misses, but the reflection of himself he once saw in her. Her silence stripped him of his mask. Without her gaze, he must face the rawness he has hidden all along. And in this confrontation lies either collapse or transformation. Some men collapse completely, fleeing into distractions. Another woman, another conquest, another drink, another obsession. They seek to drown the silence in noise, to bury the abyss with superficial triumphs. But the ghost of her silence follows them, whispering that the wound is not hers to heal, but theirs to face. Others, though fewer, will use this collapse as initiation. They will recognize that the emptiness is not punishment, but invitation. An invitation to shadow work, to individuation, to the painful rebirth of the authentic self. And what of the woman? Her silence is not meant to destroy, though it may feel destructive. It is not vengeance, though he may call it so. It is liberation. She is no longer the caretaker of his ego, no longer the mirror of his identity. In her silence, she reclaims her presence for herself. She rediscovers the rhythm of her own being, no longer bent around his chaos. This is why her silence terrifies and haunts him. It reveals a woman who cannot be owned, who cannot be begged into returning, who has remembered that her worth does not rise and fall in his recognition. When silence settles, it becomes a landscape where his ego no longer feels safe. What once felt like a familiar home, her attention, her care, her reassurance has vanished, and in its place stands the barren truth of his own vulnerability. This is the moment Jung would describe as a confrontation with the shadow, that neglected and often despised part of the psyche. The silence of a woman strips away the masks he wears for the world, forcing him to stand naked before his own insecurities. And in that exposure, he trembles. A man thrives on reflection. His confidence often feeds on the way she looked at him, the way she laughed at his stories, the way she softened his flaws with compassion. Her silence removes that reflection, leaving him alone with questions he cannot easily answer. Who am I without her gaze? What am I worth without her presence? These questions carve into him like a chisel against stone, revealing cracks that were always there but hidden beneath the surface of attention. For the woman, this silence is not emptiness, but fullness. It is not the absence of feeling, but the reclamation of it. Her stillness is not passivity, it is the radical act of turning energy inward. She steps away from the exhausting cycle of feeding his ego and begins nourishing her own spirit. In her silence, she rediscovers the beauty of her own company, the forgotten pulse of her own desires. To the outside world, she may appear distant, cold, detached. But within, her silence vibrates with sovereignty, with the quiet music of self-possession. This shift unsettles him because it removes the dynamic he relied upon. He once believed her affection was permanent, her giving endless, her presence guaranteed. When she no longer performs this role, the ground beneath him cracks. He calls it cruelty because he mistakes detachment for rejection. But in truth, her silence does not scream, "I do not care." It whispers, "I care for myself first." And for a man unaccustomed to this, it feels like betrayal. Jung observed that the anima, when withdrawn, can plunge a man into despair or awaken him to depths he never imagined. When her silence mirrors nothing back to him, he is forced to recognize the shadows he has long denied. Perhaps it is the boy who still aches for a mother's constant reassurance, the teenager who never learned to self-soothe, the man who measured his worth only through conquest. All these unhealed fragments rise to the surface in the face of her detachment. He can choose to run from them, or he can choose to face them. But most men run. They chase new faces, new voices, new mirrors to restore the image of themselves they lost. They tell themselves she was cold, unloving, ungrateful. Yet no matter how many reflections they gather, none feel the same. The silence of the one who withdrew becomes a ghost, haunting them with what cannot be replaced. It is not the woman herself they chase, but the illusion of selfhood they lost when her gaze turned away. And still, her silence deepens. She is not silent to punish but to heal. She is not absent to manipulate but to remember herself. This is her individuation, the Jungian process of becoming whole. In detachment, she no longer bends to the weight of his expectations. She no longer shapes herself around his desires. Instead, she becomes sovereign, a woman who knows that love without freedom is not love at all, but bondage. You, too, may have felt this truth. The more you withdraw into your own center, the more magnetic you become, not because you are performing a lure, but because mystery awakens in stillness. The feminine mystery, when embodied without explanation, unsettles and captivates in equal measure. Men may call it dangerous, but danger is only felt by the ego that cannot control it. True power is never loud. It resides in silence, in restraint, in the refusal to trade sovereignty for validation. And so his desire intensifies. The more she withdraws, the more he obsesses. He replays every word she ever spoke, analyzes every glance, imagines her indifference, as if it were strategy. Yet he cannot see that her silence is not about him at all. It is about her. This is the lesson men resist most, that a woman's detachment is not a tactic to ensnare, but an awakening to her own essence. The paradox is cruel for him but liberating for her. The less she gives, the more power she holds. Not because she manipulates, but because she finally embodies the truth that her value is not defined by what she gives away. Her silence becomes his torment because it is her liberation. And in that reversal lies the seed of transformation for both. For him, an initiation into shadow work. For her, a return to sovereignty. His nights grow longer when silence takes root. The man lies awake, staring at ceilings that offer no answers, haunted by the emptiness her absence carved into him. He replays moments, words, touches, searching for hidden codes in what has already passed. This is the obsessive loop that silence creates, the mind spinning endlessly, trying to fill the void with meaning. And yet the more he grasps, the less he holds. Jung would say he is circling the shadow, terrified to enter but unable to escape its gravity. Her silence forces him to encounter truths he has long avoided. He begins to see that much of his love was entangled with ego, with the need to be reflected, adored, sustained by her constant attention. Without that mirror, the fragile scaffolding of his identity trembles. He may rage, he may beg, he may attempt grand gestures, but none of these can summon back the presence that has already turned inward. The feminine mystery cannot be bribed, cannot be coerced, cannot be possessed. It is either freely offered or not at all. This is where the masculine ego begins to fracture. Men often believe power lies in conquest, in persuasion, in the ability to dominate or convince. But silence defeats all of these. It cannot be debated, argued down, or overpowered. Her silence stands like an immovable wall, unyielding and serene. It is the wall of sovereignty, and for him it feels like rejection. Yet in truth it is not rejection but redirection. She is no longer pouring her energy outward, she is anchoring it within. And that shift makes her untouchable. Some men will call this manipulation, but that is only the ego crying out against its starvation. Her silence is not a tactic, but a boundary. It says, I will no longer feed what drains me. I will no longer bend into shapes that are not mine. To the man who depended upon her devotion, this feels like betrayal. But to the woman, it is liberation, the moment she reclaims her life from being the caretaker of another's illusions. You can feel the depth of this shift if you imagine her energy. Before, it was scattered outward, soothing, explaining, reassuring, chasing. Now it gathers inward, becoming dense, radiant, magnetic. She becomes like the moon, luminous without striving, pulling tides without effort. This radiance unsettles him because it is no longer his to command. He once believed he owned her presence. Now he realizes he never did. The irony is cruel. The more she withdraws, the more his desire ignites. He begins to mistake longing for love, obsession for intimacy. Yet what he chases is not her essence, but the reflection of himself she once provided. Her silence has stripped him of the fantasy, that he was complete through her devotion. This realization cuts deep, for it forces him to see that he has been running from his own incompleteness all along. Jung taught that what is not made conscious will return as fate. The man who refuses to face his own emptiness will repeat the cycle, chasing new women, new reflections, new illusions, until the silence of one detachment finally breaks him open. Only then can he turn inward and begin the painful, necessary work of individuation. Only then can he learn that love cannot be built on possession, but only on freedom. For the woman, silence is not an act of destruction, but of creation. It creates space for her to breathe again, to hear her own thoughts, to remember the passions she buried beneath the weight of his needs. She no longer exhausts herself proving her worth, because she finally realizes worth is not proven, it simply is. Silence gives her back to herself, and in this return she becomes both softer and stronger, both tender and untouchable. To the outside world she may look mysterious, even dangerous. Men may whisper that she is cold, that she is difficult, that she has become impossible to reach. But those are only the projections of those who cannot control what they do not understand. In truth, her silence is not absence but presence, the presence of someone who no longer apologizes for existing on her own terms. And here lies the paradox. The more she centers herself, the more irresistible she becomes. Not because she plays a role, but because she embodies the eternal mystery of the feminine, the energy that Jung described as anima, the bridge between conscious and unconscious, seen and unseen. Men feel this energy instinctively. It unsettles their egos, awakens their longing, and forces them into confrontation with the parts of themselves they would rather avoid. His torment is not her cruelty. It is his own unfinished work, brought to light by her silence. He is haunted because she no longer shields him from himself. Her silence is the mirror turned away, and in that absence he must finally look into the abyss of who he is without her reflection. The silence lingers like a storm cloud that never breaks, a weight pressing on his chest, a reminder that something, once constant, has slipped beyond his grasp. He does not always name it as fear, but fear is what it is. The dread of being unseen, of existing without the glow of her attention. To Jung, this is the dissolution of projection. When the anima is withdrawn, the man is forced to realize that what he adored was not her alone, but the part of himself reflected back through her. Now that reflection has vanished, and he wanders through the ruins of his own illusions, he may lash out, telling himself she is cruel, manipulative, heartless. He may accuse her of playing games, but these accusations are nothing more than defenses, flimsy shields against the truth that her silence is not aimed at him at all. It is aimed at herself, her need to reclaim the fragments of her soul that were scattered in the service of his ego. Her detachment is not punishment. It is self-preservation. It is the refusal to bleed out her essence for the comfort of another. The ego cannot bear this truth. For years, perhaps, he has lived on borrowed light, feeding on the admiration in her eyes, the warmth of her presence, the certainty of her devotion. Without it, he feels hollow. This hollowness terrifies him because it reveals the reality that he has not yet built an identity independent of reflection. He depended on her not simply for love, but for existence. Her silence takes away that scaffolding, leaving him face to face with a question as ancient as the human soul. Who am I when no one watches? Some men collapse under this weight. They spiral into obsession, checking phones late at night, composing messages they never send, haunted by images of her walking away. They may seek substitutes, drowning the echo of her silence in work, in distractions, in the arms of others. But no matter how loud the noise becomes, silence waits in the background. It cannot be buried, for silence is not external. It lives within him now, woven into the fabric of his unhealed self. Others, though fewer, will sense in this collapse an opportunity. The silence that haunts them becomes a summons, a call to turn inward rather than outward. Jung spoke of individuation as the journey toward wholeness, a path carved through confrontation with shadow. A man who accepts her silence as mirror rather than rejection may find himself at the threshold of transformation. He begins to recognize that the emptiness is not hers to fill, but his to face. He learns, perhaps for the first time, that love cannot survive if built on dependency. True intimacy arises not from possession, but from the meeting of two sovereign souls. For the woman, this silence becomes her sanctuary. It allows her to rediscover what she silenced within herself. Dreams put aside, desires postponed, passions neglected. She realizes that her energy is too sacred to be squandered on endless proving. Silence restores her rhythm, her wholeness. She no longer chases or explains or justifies. She simply is, and in that being she becomes radiant. You may have felt this in your own life, the paradox of detachment. The more you stop chasing, the more powerful your presence becomes. The more you withdraw from feeding what drains you, the more magnetic your essence grows. This is not strategy, it is nature. The river does not beg for recognition, yet it carves valleys. The moon does not plead to be seen, yet it commands the tides. Feminine silence carries the same gravity. It draws without effort. It unsettles. Without intention, it awakens without words. To him it feels unbearable. To her it feels like freedom. And therein lies the great divide. One sees silence as torment, the other as liberation. Jung would say this is the clash between projection and individuation. He projects his hunger onto her absence, mistaking it for cruelty. She reclaims her soul through detachment, finding in silence the doorway back to herself. The longer the silence stretches, the clearer the lesson becomes. Love that demands constant sacrifice is not love, it is hunger. Desire that collapses without validation is not intimacy, it is ego. The silence of a woman unmasks both truths with ruthless clarity. And though it breaks him, it also offers him a rare gift, the chance to grow beyond himself. The days pass, yet the silence remains, and it begins to echo in places he never expected. In the marketplace of his thoughts, in the quiet pauses between conversations, even in the noise of crowded rooms, her absence hums beneath it all. This is the kind of silence that follows a man like a shadow. It is not only the loss of her words, but the collapse of the mirror she once held before him. Without that mirror, the mask he wore so confidently begins to crack, exposing the rawness he worked tirelessly to conceal. This haunting is not accidental. It is the psyche demanding recognition. Jung reminded us that the unconscious will not remain hidden. What is ignored will eventually rise with force. Her silence becomes the force that pulls it upward. He may fight against it, reaching for distractions, drowning himself in work, or losing himself in fleeting conquests. Yet the silence slips through the cracks of every defense, whispering truths he cannot escape. You are not whole. You have lived on borrowed light. You must face yourself. The irony is cruel yet precise. The more he resists, the deeper the silence cuts. The more he runs, the closer the shadow follows. This is the paradox of the feminine withdrawal. It does not pursue, yet it beckons. Not by intention, but by the mystery it embodies. A woman who withdraws into herself radiates something that cannot be controlled, something both terrifying and magnetic. Men sense this instinctively, and it awakens in them the ancient fear of what cannot be possessed. And so, he begins to confuse silence with power games, telling himself she withholds to manipulate. But this interpretation reveals more about him than her. It is his ego that feels starved, his pride that feels dethroned. For the woman, silence is not a strategy, but a return. She is not playing. She is remembering. She is remembering that her essence does not exist to be consumed. She is remembering that validation is not the currency of worth. She is remembering that love, if it demands self-erasure, is not love at all. In this remembering, she embodies a different kind of presence. The presence of the high priestess archetype, seated between worlds, veiled yet luminous, untouched by desperation. To him, this presence feels unattainable, dangerous even. But danger exists only for the ego that cannot command it. For the awakened man, This silence becomes an invitation to enter his own depths. You may notice this pattern in life. When you no longer chase, others often chase you harder. But this is not because of games, it is because sovereignty unsettles. A sovereign woman, one who no longer begs to be chosen, radiates a frequency that disrupts the unconscious dynamics of dependence. She is no longer a mirror for another's ego. She is a mirror only for herself, and that shift is both magnetic and terrifying. He becomes restless, pacing the labyrinth of his mind. He imagines conversations that never happen, composes apologies laced with desperation, or convinces himself that her silence masks longing. Yet deep down he knows the truth. Her silence is not about him at all. It is about her wholeness, her reclamation, her refusal to carry what is not hers. This truth unsettles him, because it dismantles the illusion that he was the center of her orbit. Jung would call this collapse both agony and initiation. The agony is obvious: the loss, the obsession, the rage that swells when control slips away. But the initiation is hidden within the pain. If he dares to embrace it, silence can become the catalyst for transformation. He may begin shadow work, confronting the boy who never learned to exist without validation, the man who confused attention with love, the ego that fed on reflection. If he chooses this path, silence becomes not torment, but teacher. Yet the outcome is never guaranteed. Many resist. Many curse the silence, labeling it cruelty to avoid facing themselves. Others accept its lesson, though slowly, painfully, one restless night at a time. And for the woman, she does not wait to see what he chooses. Her silence is not conditional upon his growth. It is her liberation, her return home. Each day, her energy gathers back into her. Each day, her radiance deepens. She is no longer the echo of his need. She becomes the song of her own soul. And it is precisely this transformation that haunts him most. Not the silence itself, but the reality it reveals. That she does not need him to be whole. The longer the silence stretches, the more it becomes a landscape of revelation. At first he feels it as rejection, a wound carved by her absence. But as days slip into weeks, he begins to realize that it is not her absence he mourns. It is the collapse of his own reflection. She no longer provides the image he clung to, and without it he feels like a man stripped of skin, exposed to the raw air of his own insecurities. Jung described this moment as the breaking of projection. When a woman withdraws her energy, the man can no longer project his fantasies onto her. She ceases to be the vessel of his anima, the canvas for his illusions. Instead, he must face the abyss within himself. For many, this abyss is unbearable. They distract themselves with noise, with conquests, with new mirrors that promise to restore the illusion. Yet beneath the surface, silence gnaws at them. It whispers that the truth cannot be avoided forever. And what of her? For the woman, silence is not absence, it is presence turned inward. She begins to see herself clearly, perhaps for the first time in years. The demands of his ego no longer drown out her inner voice. In the quiet, she remembers who she was before she bent herself into shapes to be loved. She recalls passions, once abandoned, dreams once silenced, desires once suppressed. Silence becomes her sanctuary, her temple of return. From the outside, she may appear cold, even merciless. But this is only because most people fear what they cannot control. A woman at peace with her silence embodies mystery, and mystery is always mistaken for danger by those who cannot understand it. Her calm unsettles him more than anger ever could. Anger can be argued with, soothed, even dominated. Silence cannot. It stands as a wall no force can move, and in its stillness lies her greatest power. This is why obsession often follows detachment. The man finds himself circling her memory, desperate for any sign that her silence will break. He interprets it as strategy, as cruelty, as punishment. But in truth, it is none of these. It is the quiet rebellion of a woman who has stopped feeding what consumes her. She does not detach to wound him. She detaches to heal herself. You might recognize the paradox. The less she gives, the more magnetic she becomes. This magnetism is not performance but authenticity. It is not a tactic but a state of being. By withdrawing, she steps into sovereignty, and sovereignty is irresistible to the unconscious. Men sense it as both danger and allure. They cannot fully grasp it, and that very impossibility ignites their obsession. Jung would remind us that what remains unconscious becomes fate. For the man, her silence reveals the very fate he has avoided, the confrontation with his own shadow. If he continues to resist, he will repeat the cycle endlessly, finding new women to mirror him, new mirrors to shatter, until finally one silence becomes unbearable enough to break him open. But if he embraces it, the silence can become initiation. It can strip him of ego illusions and call him into a deeper kind of love, one rooted not in possession but in soul. Meanwhile, her path diverges. She does not linger at the edge of his collapse. She moves forward, her silence now a rhythm of self-possession. Each step into stillness strengthens her. She no longer apologizes for her boundaries, no longer bends to soothe another's chaos. She has discovered the truth that her worth is not proven in sacrifice, it simply is. And in that truth, she becomes untouchable. This is what haunts him most. Not only the loss of her voice, but the realization that her silence means she no longer belongs to his world of control. She has become sovereign, and sovereignty cannot be summoned back by need. His hunger only deepens her absence. His pursuit only sharpens her detachment. The silence grows not weaker with time, but stronger, until it becomes the final word. And yet, there is beauty, even in his torment. For her silence may be the very thing that saves him, if he dares to let it. In the hollow she leaves behind lies, the invitation to rebuild himself, not as a man propped up by another's reflection, but as one who has faced his shadow and emerged whole. The silence becomes permanent, a boundary that cannot be undone, and in that permanence, the lessons settle, like stones in the riverbed of his soul. He carries the echo of her absence, sometimes as regret, sometimes as longing, but always as reminder. For in her silence he was confronted with the truth that no woman can forever sustain a man's fragile reflection. He was forced to face the shadow that had ruled him unseen, and for her the silence ripens into clarity. No longer burdened by the endless task of feeding what drains her, she flourishes. She remembers the forgotten colors of her own spirit, the voice that was once silenced, the rhythm of a life lived for herself. Her detachment does not harden her. It frees her. She is softer now, but softer like water that shapes mountains, unyielding in essence, unstoppable in flow. Jung would say this is individuation, the gathering of lost fragments into wholeness. She no longer waits to be chosen, for she has chosen herself. She no longer fears being alone, for she has discovered sovereignty. She becomes luminous in her stillness, magnetic in her calm, a force beyond possession. And so the haunting remains with him, not because she punishes him, but because he cannot forget the mirror she withdrew. It was through her silence that he glimpsed the abyss of his own unhealed self. Some men will run from it forever, circling through obsessions and distractions, but others will step into it, broken but willing, and emerge transformed. For her, the story ends not in loss but in ascension. The silence is not void but sanctuary, not rejection but reclamation. It is the proof that she does not need to explain, to justify, to beg. She only needs to be, and in that being, she is enough. The calm woman who knows her worth doesn't chase, she chooses. Andy.